Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to my Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 127. I'm talking to John Ziegler. We're going to talk about the growth of woke and political correctness in the world of sports. How are you, John?
I'm okay, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So tell me, when you got started back in the 1980s? Can you tell us about when and where you got started in sports journalism?
Yeah, it was basically the late 80s, early 90s. I had gone to Georgetown University, where I covered the Georgetown basketball team quite extensively back in the heyday of the Georgetown Hoyas, and I'd always wanted to be a sportscaster. And after having a few off-air jobs, I got an on-air job as a TV sports anchor, TV reporter, weekend anchor, weekday reporter at the NBC affiliate in Steubenville, Ohio, Wheeling, West Virginia, which was market 145, I think, at the time. I think I was making $12,800 a year. And it was actually a fantastic job because it was essentially in the Pittsburgh media market. So we were covering Pittsburgh pro sports, Cleveland pro sports, Ohio State, West Virginia. So really, as a first on-air job, I couldn't have asked for anything more. And then I did the same job, sports anchor reporter at the Fox affiliate in Raleigh, North Carolina. And then after that, I went into other things that were much more political based when it came to media. But my first incarnation as a media personality was as a television sportscaster. I've also done sports talk radio in Philadelphia in the year 2000. I did that at WIP, which is a legendary sports talk radio station in Philadelphia. That's where I grew up, was in the Philadelphia area, which is obviously a very unique sports market in itself.
Yes, definitely. So it's you're not the first person to go from sports over to more hard news, but yeah. So what was the Georgetown, of course, having one of the most really the first prominent African American coaches at the time, really was and really the first probably well known and of course very successful one. What was it like there? Was there a lot of talk about race or not, or
it's interesting, Chris, that you're referencing John Thompson, the legendary basketball coach at Georgetown. And I really think that dealing with John Thompson for 3 or 4 years was probably the element of my Georgetown education that had the most impact on me. It might not even be close. Of course, I don't think very much of my Georgetown education, because it really hasn't helped me at all in the things that I've decided to do with my life, and it certainly hasn't helped me in my career. But it's only been recently that I've fully comprehended the impact of dealing with John Thompson. Like, for instance, in my career, I've kind of become very well known for not being intimidated by any sort of celebrity or news personality or any situation. And I've often wondered, okay, so why is that? Why is it I don't have any fear? Why is it that I'm willing and able to get some very high profile interviews in my career? Why is it that I have no real fear? And I really think a lot of it has to do with the fact that as a 19, 20-year-old kid, my first real experience in sports journalism was dealing with the most intimidating figure in all of sports at the time, which was John Thompson, a 6'10" black guy who was very intimidating, knew he was intimidating, relished how intimidating he was, used that intimidation factor with the news media. And it was kind of like a trial by fire. If you were able to deal with that, everything else seemed pretty easy in retrospect. And I really do believe that had a major impact on me. I think dealing with John Thompson, which was everything that you would have perceived it to be. I mean, he was the real deal. When he walked into a room, the room stopped. because he was the focal point, and you did what he wanted to do, or else. And that was a real learning experience for me. And I had my battles with John Thompson. I did not back down from John Thompson, and I don't think he really liked me very much. But it was definitely a learning experience, and I think it has probably helped me, for better or for worse, throughout my entire career, not just my sports career, but also my career in documentaries and talk radio and podcasting and in the political realm.
Yeah, he was a big guy, and this is a college where basketball has always been the number one sport. I mean, you don't really hear about anything that they do in football. So yeah, because he looks like he fits right in with the players all the time. So that's interesting. But one of the things you might have noticed, though, is, did you notice anything already though? Because one of the earliest references I remember was when Howard Cosell called this guy named Alvin Garrett a little monkey. And here's where he and of course he tried to explain it later, when he was talking about that. But I thought that was interesting that and later, and of course, to his credit, he actually had a chance in it to explain himself. But it was kind of interesting that but here's, for example, that little clip we've got of Howard where he says,
To the reporters, they were told that I called Alvin Garrett a little monkey. Nothing of the sort, and you fellas know it. No man respects Alvin Garrett more than I do. I talked about that man's ability to be so elusive despite the smallness of size. You had him in the Pro Bowl the first quarter. I don't know what they're listening to.
Yeah, I mean, that was Howard Cosell talking, trying to, compliment the guy on the fact that he was a pretty little guy, but he could get around and just, unfortunately Howard wasn't fired for that, but
well, I actually wrote about that episode in a book called The Death of Free Speech that I wrote back in 2005. I do agree with you that was kind of a seminal moment. Howard wasn't fired for it, but that was the beginning of the end for Howard Cosell. And of course, it was based on an absurdity. I mean, of course, it's rather ironic that clip you're showing it deals with the Washington Redskins, which do not exist anymore because of the fact that their name has now been deemed to be politically incorrect. So there's a lot of layers to this onion, but it was absolutely ridiculous that Howard Cosell, of all people, a man who was probably most well known for his relationship with Muhammad Ali and his defense of Muhammad Ali, that somehow Howard Cosell would be seen as racist because he called Alvin Garrett a little monkey. The whole monkey thing has always bothered me greatly when it comes to alleged racism, because to me, in order to see that as a racist remark, you have to be racist yourself. In other words, only a racist would see that as a racist comment, because somehow you are equating, bizarrely, African Americans with monkeys. No, what Howard Cosell was doing there, and other people have done and gotten in trouble for after this, is that a monkey obviously has a certain type of athleticism, and he was relating that type of athleticism to what Garrett was able to do on the field. And and the reason why you would do that is because you don't think of African Americans as being somehow different than any other race and closer to monkeys. I guess that's the theory behind this being racist. And so that's been, on that particular issue, that's what bothers me the most, is that you have to be a racist in order to believe that that's an inherently racist comment. Now, could it be a racist comment? Sure, in a different context by a different person. Absolutely. I'm not naive that a racist might make that comparison, but to inherently believe that that's racist, I think you have to be the racist.
Yes, indeed. And then later we go into the 80s, of course, with this we of course go later, with the when CBS fired Mr. Snyder, Jimmy the Greek, who was also originally from Steubenville, Ohio, where he says, his theories on why, African American athletes ended up stronger.
The slave owner would breed his big black to his big woman so that he could have a big black kid.
And Snyder said that.
I mean, yeah, so I don't know if what he's saying is necessarily historically incorrect there, but, he's not really saying that there's anything wrong with, it's not inherently racist. It's just acknowledging, a tragedy in American history.
I actually could not agree with you more. And I have a pretty strong connection to this story, largely because of the fact that Jimmy the Greek grew up in Steubenville, where I was a sportscaster, which I'll get to momentarily. But from a historical standpoint, what Jimmy the Greek said there has been validated and verified by many African-American historians. This is really not even a point of controversy. And he wasn't justifying it. He wasn't making the argument for black inferiority. In fact, he was actually literally making the argument for black superiority in certain athletic endeavors because of evolution. Now, how accurate that is and how much of an explanation that is for what the basis of the question was, which was, why is it that black athletes tend to dominate certain sports, which is a subject, of course, the sports media has no interest in delving into deeply, largely because of the legacy of Jimmy the Greek, because no one wants to end up like Jimmy the Greek. And let me tell you, Jimmy the Greek was completely destroyed by what happened. He ends up getting fired from CBS and NFL Today, where he was a legendary figure. His good buddy, Brent Musburger, completely throws him under the bus. He goes from being one of the most influential sports media personalities in the world to no one will even take his phone call. His career is completely ended. This was, in today's day and age, there would have been, he could have had an independent online betting business and probably done very well for himself using his celebrity, but that option didn't exist then. And I can't ever know for sure that this is the case, but I'm pretty sure I was the last person to ever interview Jimmy the Greek. And I did so off camera because I was so heartbroken by his situation. And he was such a sad figure. And he was so out of it at that point that I didn't even want to use a camera. I probably, I mentioned my lack of intimidation thanks to my John Thompson experience. I basically finagled my way into Jimmy the Greek's house and waited for him to come home. I was given permission by the maid, and I'll never forget. This would have been in early 1995. And so this is like 6 or 7 years after he gets fired, right? And I'm waiting around. I'm waiting in his living room for him to come home. And like everyone, a lot of people do at that time, they have magazines on the kitchen or on the coffee table or next to the fireplace, and newspapers and what have you. And I happened to look at, what newspapers and magazines are piled there. And every single one of them stopped the moment he was fired. Like it was as if time had stopped in Jimmy the Greek's world. They were all from right around the period of time of his firing. And this was several years later. And I found that to be very poignant and telling because he ceased to exist. He effectively was dead. He was killed. Jimmy the Greek was killed. His body kept going on for several more years. But Jimmy the Greek as a person was killed by that cancellation. Now, he wasn't an incredibly important figure. He was a very well-known figure. He was, and I wasn't even a big fan of the guy, but I felt very badly for him. And then, ironically, this was the week of the Super Bowl where the 49ers are playing the Chargers. And I remember the only time the old Jimmy the Greek spark was still there. I mean, this was a guy who was unshaven in his pajamas in the afternoon by the time he came home with his wife from whatever they were doing. And I mean, he was just a ghost of his former self until I asked him who he thought was going to win the Super Bowl. And it was clear he didn't have a really great idea of the nature of the two. He knew the two teams that were playing, but he didn't really know, much of the details. But that the old Jimmy the Greek spark was still there. And I found it pretty ironic that he actually gave me a wrong pick, saying that he thought the Chargers were going to cover the spread, and the Chargers ended up getting crushed by the 49ers in that particular Super Bowl. But that was my Jimmy the Greek experience, which was really rather tragic.
Yeah. It is, because I heard somebody else said I saw him 5 years later. I didn't recognize him because it just took a lot of wind out of him. That was the first time I remember anybody being fired. Really remember a big firing from somebody like that. Yeah, where they just went and said, and yeah, no surprise either. Brent Busburger's always seemed like a go along to get along guy. He would never say anything even remotely controversial. I mean, yeah.
Well, I remember being pissed off at Brent for so blatantly throwing Jimmy the Greek under the bus. And I think more so than the Howard Cosell situation, I think the Jimmy the Greek deal, along with Al Campanis, which was in the same realm of time period, those circumstances, I think, had enormous ripple effects throughout all of society, but specifically sports, because it terrified people to the topic of race. And no one was willing or able to tell the truth after that. And when you are not allowed to tell the truth, that's going to cause problems. And people became very, very intimidated and frankly frightened of doing anything in the realm of race that might even be remotely seen as racist. And so therefore we get an overreaction. The pendulum swings too much in the other direction. And I think we've seen a lot in sports and in today's day and age. It's all as a direct result of basically those three situations: the Howard Cosell, the Jimmy the Greek, the Al Campanis. Although Al Campanis I would put into a different category because he was was he the general manager of the Dodgers at the time or some other administrative position with the Dodgers?
He was an executive with the Dodgers. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So he went on Nightline and said some things that clearly were racist about how black people don't have the capabilities to be managers, and then related that to their inability to swim. I mean, that was just crazy, especially coming from a guy who was associated with Jackie Robinson. That's why he was even on the show to begin with, was to talk about his role in Jackie Robinson playing for the Dodgers. Yes. And so, I mean, holy irony, Batman. And so I felt a little bit bad for Al Campanis, because here he was, a guy who was clearly old. I think he was in the Astrodome doing a remote interview with Ted Koppel. I mean, an old person, especially in that day and age, doing a remote interview, that's a recipe for disaster anyway. Because it's just people don't understand if you've never done it. You do a remote television interview, it is very, very difficult. I mean, especially for an older person, you're disoriented. You're not seeing the person you're talking to. Sometimes there's a delay in your ear, especially back in that era. I mean, there's all sorts of things that can go wrong that might cause you to go down a path. Now, granted, he wouldn't have said those things if he didn't believe them at some level, but I think it was there's no question that situation had a major impact, along with these other two that we've already talked about, when it came to setting the tone for what the rules were when it came to discussions, especially of race, and especially in the realm of sports.
Yes, we love Jackie Robinson. We also loved Larry Doby, who was the first player to integrate all those American League parks too. We don't want to forget about Larry Doby. So yeah. Yeah. So yeah, and that's really where sports, I think, could be have a positive impact on, on breaking down those barriers. When little kids, see a guy who can play sports great, they don't care. You see a guy wearing the helmet, you can't really tell if he's black or white until he takes the helmet off. I think
no question that sports at its best, sports is the great uniter when it comes to race. But unfortunately, I think it has become a force largely of division when it comes to race certainly in recent time, not in totality, but certainly in certain situations.
But it also seems to indicate that maybe it seems like a lot of the sports reporters were probably more politically correct than the general public.
Well, look, I mean, today sports reporters are the most politically correct, most woke of any group that there is. And I've thought a lot about why this is. And having once been part of the sports media, I've always believed very counterintuitively that sports media personalities are actually more liberal than the average news media personality. I mean, the news media is famously liberally biased, but the sports media, especially in this day and age, is ridiculously liberally biased. And I think part of it is, let's be clear, I mean, like ESPN is full of white males, not as much as it used to be, but back in the heyday, ESPN was basically all white males, right? Mm-hmm. Well, who are the people that are most vulnerable to cancellation, especially when it comes to the issue of race? White males. Sports jobs are incredibly difficult. Good ones are very, very difficult to get. And if you get fired, using the Jimmy the Greek example, it is very difficult if you're fired for especially racial reasons, almost impossible to get a replacement job. So your number one goal is keep the gig. The gigs are incredibly lucrative. They're prestigious at their best. They're fun. Back in the heyday, they were fun. I mean, you're literally paid to go watch sports events. And so you have to basically step over your dead mother to get these jobs. That's a literal quote from a legend by the name of Glenn Brenner, who I worked for, who was a TV sportscaster in Washington, D.C., who unfortunately passed away many years ago. He was an absolute genius. And I mean, that's what he would tell interns is you want to get a job in this business, you have to be willing to step over your dead mother because everybody wants the gig. And so when that's the case, no one's going to do anything to threaten the gig. And the easiest way to threaten the gig in this day and age, especially, is to say anything that might be deemed even theoretically politically incorrect. So then therefore everyone goes along with the pack, with the mob, with the woke mob. And no one's going to do anything that might upset the woke mob because you might get run over and eaten by the pack. And so that's the basic explanation for why sports media is so pathetic, so woke, so cowardly, so politically correct. It's because of the lack of job security. That's really at the essence of it. That's the essence of the whole situation.
Yeah, there are thousands of people watching Monday Night Football, and they say, "Boy, I could do that job. Why don't I try? I could do that job better than these guys? I should try to get that job." Yeah, you have one person working, and there are hundreds who want that job. Yeah, and yet
when I got the job as the TV sportscaster in Steubenville, Ohio, again making $12,800 a year, I think was my original contract. Mm-hmm. And by the way, signing autographs as a local celebrity, that was pretty funny. I mean, I'm basically below the poverty line, and and signing autographs.
People who make more money than you do,
right? Yeah, but to get that job, I mean, I don't know how many people actually applied for that specific job that I got. But generally, any halfway decent on-air sports job back in the day, back in the early 90s, back when people were still watching television, over-the-air television in very high numbers, it would not be unusual for there to be 50 to 100 legitimate applications for that job. And so getting that job was basically it was almost a miracle. You had to not only be qualified, but you had to, your tape had to come at exactly the right time for the news director to put it into his video machine and be in a good mood and decide, hey, this person looks interesting. I mean, so once you get that job, you're not going to do anything unless you're stupid like me, because I've done a lot of stupid things to threaten jobs because I don't really care about political correctness. But unless you're someone like me, you're going to just go along. And going along means being very, very woke, especially in today's sports media environment.
This is not a racial issue, but I got to ask, a few years later after this, what did you think of the entire Lisa Olson controversy? I mean, this really was interesting because sports journalists were trying to get in opposite sex bathrooms long before the transgender movement came along.
Yeah, for people who don't remember, that was the first, at least famous episode of a female reporter and the men's locker room covering sporting events. I have to say that's a tough issue because access to the locker room is an important part of being a sports reporter. It's not as big a deal as it used to be because now generally there's formal press conferences outside of the locker room. But for many decades, that used to be the way that you did your job. You went into the locker room in order to get the interviews. I guess it was mostly just from a logistical standpoint. I remember covering the Pittsburgh Pirates during their early 90s when they were on the verge of being a tremendous baseball team that was stacked with Barry Bonds and all sorts of other stars, and Barry Bonds would choke in the playoffs. And I remember literally crawling under the legs of a mob of sports reporters surrounding Barry Bonds after one very poor playoff series where the Pirates lost largely because of Barry Bonds, because I wanted to confront Barry Bonds and I couldn't get into the scrum. I mean, literally crawled on my hands and knees and ended up with my face almost in Barry Bonds' crotch. That's a true story. Trying to ask him questions, which was not exactly a position of leverage. But the point is that the locker room, I've been in a lot of locker rooms, and that's an important part of the job. And when you're in a locker room, you're going to get nudity. That's just the nature of the deal. And there was this culture that no one really cared about that because it was all men. Homosexuality wasn't even thought of as a major issue. And then slowly but surely, women started to become part of the profession. And so what do you do about that? And I have no doubt that understanding the locker room culture, that there have been sports reporters who are women who have faced some very uncomfortable situations. Now, most of them are, a guy happens to be naked by accident and, you're exposed to something you may or may not have wanted to see. I also have no doubt believing that there are jokes that are told that maybe even women are put into very uncomfortable situations. I know, having spoken about this to my former co-host on my two podcasts, with the benefit of hindsight and the death of journalism, Liz Habib, who was a longtime sportscaster in Los Angeles at the Fox affiliate there. I know that Liz has had some uncomfortable situations in locker rooms, but she has a good sense of humor about it. She's tough. So I don't really have a great answer to that other than, maybe you just don't allow anybody in the locker room because, in this day and age, there's all sorts of bad things that can happen when nudity is involved. And the perception of what is abuse, what is harassment. The definitions of those words have changed, I think, rather dramatically. So I've never felt very strongly about the Lisa Olson situation because I see both sides. But there's no question that, look, the increase in women in sportscasting has had a major impact on how sports is covered, for better or for worse. There's probably some things that are better, and there are probably some things that are worse because of it. It's just, it's the nature of humanity.
Where do we ever hear any stories about, men going into women's locker rooms? I mean, or is that just never, or does that just never happen? I mean,
I've never been in it. I have covered women's basketball, but in college, it never occurred to me to go into a women's locker room. Never thought about it. It was not part of the culture. I doubt that. I think that's probably it. I think it was a cultural thing that no one would ever think to go into a woman's locker room for a post-game interview of any sort. And I also think that there's an anatomical difference, obviously, between men and women that I think is important to understand when you're dealing with the exposure issue and men and women are biologically different. I realize that we no longer really accept that as reality, but that is a reality. But you're right. I've never heard of a male sports reporter going into a female locker room and being exposed to nudity in any way, shape, or form. So, but I think that's probably just an inherent difference between men and women. And I mean, look, I have no doubt that there were some male athletes that would probably show off for female reporters or think they were showing off, which would never in a million years happen with female athletes with male reporters in a locker room. So I just think there are inherent biological and psychological differences between men and women.
And something else that happened too, that was, I think Paul Tagliabue was very much, and he was the NFL commissioner at the time, and he was also a turning point, because you also remember later though, he created that controversy over the Super Bowl being in Arizona, and basically said to them, if you don't pass this Martin Luther King holiday, I'm going to pull the Super Bowl out of Arizona. And the voters actually said, well, screw you, we'll vote it down. And so then he said, okay, we'll move the Super Bowl. This was the Super Bowl that was scheduled for 1993. Yeah.
Well, Paul Tagliabue was actually a Georgetown guy. In fact, Paul Tagliabue, until Patrick Ewing came along, held a lot of records at Georgetown for playing basketball, believe it or not. Wow. My father knew Paul Tagliabue very well. He went to school at the same time period as Paul Tagliabue at Georgetown. Anyway, I mean, so he's a nice guy, but I could not agree with you more that was another seminal moment when you use the Super Bowl as blackmail for a state to institute a holiday for someone who's not even related to the National Football League. I mean, what exactly is the connection there between Martin Luther King and the NFL, other than you now view yourself as, I guess, the political action committee for black athletes in the National Football League? Frankly, I think it's even insulting to black athletes, because there's all sorts of reasons to theoretically be against a Martin Luther King holiday that have nothing to do with race. I mean, there's all sorts of other aspects of that got completely lost. I mean, in other words, it was thought that, well, the only reason why you could possibly be against this holiday is if you are racist, which is just flat out false. And so I think that issue that you raised is vastly underrated, because I do think it's set, again, much like Howard Cosell, Jimmy the Greek, Al Campanis, it set the tone and the rules and the foundation for the way the dialogue would go down in sports. And then we see it, a couple of years ago, where Atlanta loses the All-Star baseball game, right? But then they have Major League Baseball has absolutely no problem with the Braves in the World Series. And I mean, it's kind of comical how arbitrary these things are. And it was, and that was over, rules involving voting, which, I mean, I don't even understand. I actually have maybe a bigger problem with the what Major League Baseball did than what the National Football League did, because that was even more overtly political. There you have a major sports league taking a extremely partisan position in a way to try to facilitate effectively Democratic outcomes. I mean, Democratic Party outcomes. I mean, that's what essentially Major League Baseball was doing. And I have to say, a large part of everything we're talking about and all the wokeness in modern sports is happening because, and this is maybe the most important thing I have to say on this whole issue, it's happening because conservative sports consumers put up with it. If conservative sports consumers did not put up with it, if there had been a backlash against Major League Baseball for what they did with the All-Star game in Georgia, say, what are you doing? You're becoming an arm of the Democratic Party. I'm done with you. And had Major League Baseball seen a major impact or backlash to that, guess what would happen? They would knock it off. They would stop. If the National Football League had seen major defections in their fan base over the whole Colin Kaepernick and kneeling for the national anthem, or in my mind, even bigger deal happening right now is that football is being ended before our eyes. Tackle football no longer exists. They're not telling you that tackle football no longer exists, but effectively it no longer exists. And conservative fans put up with it. Conservative fans put up, and this is my biggest pet peeve, conservative fans put up with incredible indignities during COVID that were not just wrong-headed and inconvenient, and these were perpetrated by every major sports entity. But it is my very, very strong belief, to my death, I will believe that it was because of the wokeness in the sports world and their reaction to COVID that my daughters did not have proper school in the year 2020, 2021 here in California. Because you cannot have normal school in that environment, especially in California, when you can't, or theoretically can't, have normal sports. And there was absolutely, positively no reason why the National Football League was canceling games willy-nilly, why college football basically didn't have a season in 2020. Games were canceled willy-nilly, where there's no fans allowed at these games, even in outdoor, spread out venues. It was completely political. It was not based in science. I believe that it was in large part, and I hate Donald Trump, I believe in large part it was because a lot of people knew all this would be very, very bad for Donald Trump's re-election campaign, and our children suffered because of it. There's a direct connection between the lack of regular sports and what happened in our schools and in other areas of life as well. But I will forever blame two entities, well, three entities more than any other. It was the Ivy League basketball tournament that began the panic. People don't remember that. But the Ivy League basketball tournament got canceled in Philadelphia in early March of 2020. And that's what started the contagion. That's what started the wildfire. Because everyone thought, oh, my God, the Ivy League, they're the smart ones. They know what they're doing. No, they don't know what they're doing. In fact, they were the worst on sports of any sports outlet there was. The Ivy League didn't even have sports in 2020, 2021, any sports at all. Yeah. They were totally wrong. They were totally wrong. And I guarantee not one person in that room making that decision to cancel their basketball tournament was going to vote for Donald Trump. Not one of them. Not one. And that's what started the contagion. But the two entities I have the most anger towards, because I don't expect anything from the Ivy League basketball tournament, right? I mean, there's that's the most woke organization you're going to possibly have is people making decisions in the Ivy League. But the people that I have the most anger for, the people that I would love to have a conversation with, although I'm sure it would go very poorly, Augusta National postponing that Masters in 2020 from April to the fall, and then not having any fans. That's number one, because Augusta National had the inclination and the power to say, you know what, this is interesting what you all are doing. But we're going to have our tournament as we always do in the second week in April. You can come if you want. We think people are going to come because they're going to want to see this. We think it's going to be safe. But look, you know, if you think it's too dangerous, you stay home and watch it on television. That's fine. You know, and you know, we'll even let you keep your ticket for next year. But we're going to have our goddamn tournament. And had that happened as it should have, it would have shown the whole world that all of this was perfectly safe. Perfectly safe. And if the Masters had done that in April of 2020, the whole world would have been different. And similarly, if the National Football League, which also has the same kind of power Augusta National has with the Masters, if the National Football League had said, okay, you know what, we realize this has been a rough time for the country, but guess what? We're having NFL football perfectly normal. And we're going to treat this like the flu. We've had people, you know, teams play games with the flu before, famously in some situations. Mm-hmm. And no one's ever died. We've not had any athlete die or even come close to dying. We didn't even have a coach die in the National Football League. We're going to go ahead and do this normally. And we're going to be a leader. And we're going to show the world what can be done here. Had that occurred, history would have been very, very different. And I have a great deal of anger at the National Football League and Augusta National because they had the power, the inclination, and the self-interest to do the right thing. And they didn't. Mm-hmm. Why? Because they were afraid of ESPN. They were afraid of the woke sports media. That's why this matters. This is not a theoretical issue. When it came to COVID, it changed the world. And what was driving it was fear of the woke sports media and specifically ESPN.
Yeah. You know, John, how much money did the NBA and the NHL lose? I mean, they had to lose a fortune in all this.
I think, because unfortunately, I think insurance company, I don't know what the role of insurance companies here were, but I do know that it had a role. Let me give you an example. It is amazing to me, going back to golf for a second. I mean, it's amazing to me. So much about what happened with COVID is unbelievable. But the lack of accountability for some of these decisions is just mind-blowing. Let's go to golf. I bet 99.9% of even sports fans do not realize that in 2020, there was no British Open men's golf tournament, the most prestigious golf tournament in the world, allegedly, the champion golfer of the year. They did not have a men's British Open in 2020. They did have a women's British Open in 2020. Now, how the hell does that make any goddamn sense? Let me tell you how it makes sense. The insurance policy was there for the men, but not for the women. I don't know that 100%, but reading the tea leaves, that's the only part of this that makes any sense. That there was an insurance policy that was going to pay off the Royal and Ancient Golf Club if for some reason they were unable to have their men's British Open. So what they decided was, well, we can't get away with having a full British Open with crowds and everything else. So we're going to lose money. So wait a minute, we'll actually make more money if we don't have it because we'll be paid by our insurance company. And then to prove how absurd it is that they didn't have any tournament at all, they had a women's version. So why can they have the women's version in the same, like 2 weeks later, what was scheduled for the men? Yeah. It's absurd, but it exposed what was really happening here, which was that the insurance companies, in my very strong opinion, putting all the pieces together here, it's the insurance companies that played a very big role in this. Now, I'm sure that the sports leagues lost money. I thought that would play a bigger role in their decision-making, but I think they thought that, you know what, we may lose money in this year, but we risk extinction and cancellation if we go ahead here. And the whole rest of the world rebels against us and thinks that we are somehow, you know, on the side of the virus. Because remember, I don't think people forget, anybody that was doing anything that was outside of the accepted COVID tyranny was being destroyed on social media. Destroyed, because I think the left realized that if, you know, it was almost like, you know, the old Berlin Wall. I mean, you know, if people behind the wall realize what's going on the other side, they're going to revolt, right? And so I think they were afraid. They were terrified. That's why what Ron DeSantis did in Florida is so important, because when Florida said, you know what, we're not doing this anymore, and nothing happened, it made eventually, it took a while, but eventually it made all these restrictions untenable, because enough people were able to see, well, wait a minute, they're not doing this in Florida and everyone's having a great time and no one's dying at any higher rate than anywhere else. So why are we doing this? Well, the same thing would have happened much sooner if entities like Augusta National and the Royal and Ancient Golf Club and the National Football League had done the right thing. Now, I never had any great expectations for college football, because other than in the Southeastern Conference, which did play and was always going to play, those entities are controlled by very woke academic institutions. So they were always going to do everything they could to not play, because they hate football. Those administrators hate football, and they also knew it was going to be, you know, good for the purpose of defeating Donald Trump if the world was very, 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 very different than it normally would be going into a presidential election.
Yeah, you know, this is something, you know, John, this is something too that you've talked about the state of the NFL. We are now living in such a much more, you know, where all of this stuff is just so, safety is so much pushed now. I mean, you know, you and I grew up, you know, when we could go out to a public swimming pool and there was probably a high diving board, and they don't have high dives anymore. You know, and they're just, and they're trying to make everything is, you know, so it's, and, you know, it's like they're going to try to create injury-free sports, and that just that's just not going to exist.
Well, I relate a lot of this back to COVID. I think the diving board issue, which is real, is an insurance company issue. I mean, this is what the price we pay for all these absurd judgments by these juries, where companies are terrified. You know, if there's an injury that occurs, they're going to get hit for millions and millions of dollars. I mean, there used to be some rationality when it came to jury verdicts and injuries. That's gone out the window, and people think that money just grows on trees. It doesn't. We all pay it, and in a lot of ways, we pay it in our freedom. I mean, amusement park rides, carnival rides are much less interesting and exciting than they used to be. Maybe they're a little bit safer, but they're nowhere near as interesting. I mean, all sorts of things that kids used to be able to do, they're not allowed to do anymore effectively, largely because of the insurance issue. But then I think the COVID thing, to me, of all the many, many, many devastating impacts of COVID, when I talk about this on my podcast, The Death of Journalism, all the time, one of the things that really impacts football in particular is we gave up our right, our sovereignty over our own medical decisions. For the first time in the history of our country that I'm aware of, we as a society decided society can decide, unelected, by the way, people who are unelected, health directors who aren't even qualified for their jobs, without any sort of vote from the legislature, edicts from governors, the society can decide for me what medical risks I'm allowed to take. Now, that is ground. That is extraordinary. That's never happened before. And that is devastating. And it's devastating specifically to football, because football was based, up until recently, in the idea that, okay, it's a dangerous sport. Everyone knows it's a dangerous sport. But the people who are playing it are making a decision. They're making a risk-reward decision. They're making their own medical risk decision.
Yeah.
And that is, you know what? I may get injured, but I'm doing this, one, because I love the sport, two, because there's rewards in it for me. I'm making a calculation and a bet that in the end, this is going to be worth the risk. The reward will be worth the risk. COVID, for the first time ever, allowed society to step in and say, no, 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 no. We are going to make that decision for you. That you are not willing or able or capable of making that risk reward decision for yourself. And so now football has decided, no, we are going to step in and we are going to make the sport way safer than you even want it to be. I mean, the vast majority of players, I mean, I think one of the more interesting things about the wussification of football is some of the people that are speaking out most strongly about it are quarterbacks, former quarterbacks, who are the most protected by these new rules. It's not defensive players that are screaming bloody murder. It's quarterbacks who think that this is a joke, what football has become. And it's all based in the idea, and you've already alluded to it, much like zero COVID, which was always insane, there are people who want zero injuries in football. Well, that's not football. That's something else. I almost wish, Chris, we would announce that we're ending tackle football instead of this pretend. We're pretending that we have not ended tackle football, but tackle football is over. And I don't know for sure that it's actually going to be flag football in the National Football League in the years to come. My guess is in 10 years, it's a round figure, could be a few years earlier than that because things seem to be happening at a rapid clip. I do think that the quarterback will be protected from being touched and probably have some sort of flag. Maybe there's be some sort of mechanism where they can tell whether the quarterback has been touched with two hands or I don't know. But I think that the with regard to the quarterback, they're gonna create rules that effectively are flag football like, because it's in the best interest of everybody who's in charge. It'll increase scoring. It'll increase the health of the stars. Stars are everything. It'll increase the length of their careers. I mean, look, Tom Brady was somehow able to play till 45. And, that's what the NFL is going to want for Patrick Mahomes or anybody else. It's very difficult to create a star. And once you get a star, you need to keep that star. And the quarterback, the football has become an entirely quarterback-based sport. It didn't used to be that way. The quarterback was always the most well-known, but even in I would say the 70s and 80s, in that era, you could argue that the quarterback was sometimes not even the most important player on the field. That used to be the running back or maybe the middle linebacker but now it's a completely quarterback-dominated sport. And therefore, you have to protect the quarterback at all costs, even if it means the cost of the sport itself.
Well, John, maybe the older quarterbacks are looking, well, oh, no, these guys they're going to be allowed to break all my passing records. and with under different rules, it's because, football scoring has gotten absurd. It really has for a lot of reasons.
Well, you know what's weird about that, though, Chris? And I haven't done a deep dive into the stats. On the college level, it's been getting ridiculous for a while, the amount of scoring.
Yeah.
I mean, yesterday, USC and California played a 50-49 game, which was a garbage game.
Yeah.
And that's typical of West Coast California football, where they don't, in high school, I can tell you, there's no tackling at all in California high school football. And that's not an exaggeration. There's just no tackling. And so, and when so that doesn't surprise me. But I have to say, I am amazed that there's not more scoring in the National Football League. The National Football League has not gotten completely crazy with regard to scoring. And I don't know how that is possible. I mean, given the rules, I'm amazed that we don't see more 40-something, 50-something games. And I'm sure that's what the National Football League wants, because that's what the non-hardcore, but the fan that they're trying to attract finds interesting. Scoring is fun. even though eventually scoring means nothing. It becomes like the NBA. I mean, I really think football is becoming like basketball. It's basketball with pads in every way, shape, or form, including how insignificant an individual score is, which is, to me, very sad.
You know, one thing, talking about injuries in football, have they made any crazy changes to, say, boxing or horse racing, which are just as dangerous or more so? I mean, there's still lots of serious injuries in horse racing.
Well, but you've seen it, but boxing and horse racing have faded completely from the landscape. They are effectively been destroyed. Now, there's a symbiotic relationship here between the media and how this happens. But boxing, which used to be a premier sport, is not even a major sport in this country anymore. And I think it's largely because it's interesting. And interestingly, I think Howard Cosell, ironically, played a role in this. He very famously, live on national television with Randall Tex Cobb against, I guess it was Larry Holmes, he went on a diatribe about how brutal the sport was and how, it was ridiculous that Randall Tex Cobb was getting the crap beat out of him. And I think from that point on, even though the Rocky movies did a decent job of trying to keep boxing relevant, boxing ceased to be relevant after Mike Tyson retired. And part of that's because of the lack of stars, but part of it's because the sport is seen as too brutal. And the media has absolutely tried to destroy horse racing too. I mean, here in Southern California, I guess it was a couple of years ago, maybe a year and a half or so ago, it feels like, the Santa Anita racetrack was in the news constantly because they were having horses die. And no one knew why horses were dying. No one knew. And but it was related, everyone thought, well, it must be related to the track. There's something going on here. Well, then all of a sudden it just stopped, and then they stopped reporting it as a news story. To my knowledge, no one ever got to the bottom of why this happened. To me, I'm an Occam's razor guy. I think sometimes there's bad luck and coincidence. And then once the media sees a trend, they start reporting on it, and then it becomes a thing. I also think that, there's probably issues with regard to the genetics of horses. I mean, I'm not an expert in this realm. I did live in Louisville, Kentucky for a while as a talk show host, so I know enough to be dangerous. But I do think that when you have as much inbreeding as you've had in the horse racing world for as long as you have, that some bad things are probably going to eventually happen. And there's also drug issues, and there's all sorts of potential reasons. But horse racing is nowhere near as big of a deal. It's almost had the same arc as boxing. Then in recent years, it has faded from being a major American sport. And I think part of that is because it's seen as not safe. I don't think that's a coincidence.
Another thing we never got to is, what do you got to say about Duke Lacrosse or Trevor Bauer?
Well, I mean, this has become a topic that I'm very much associated with because I did an entire epic podcast called With the Benefit of Hindsight about the entire Penn State Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky scandal, which I am positive I have proven against all odds was totally and completely fraudulent. None of what you were told in the Penn State Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky case actually happened. None of it. I know that's shocking to people who have not studied it, but I have for over a decade, and I've proven it with the Benefit of Hindsight podcast, co-hosted by Liz Habib, who I already referenced in this interview. But that's not the only story that I've been involved with that's similar. I know Matt Lauer got railroaded. I now believe Michael Jackson got railroaded. I believe Trevor Bauer got railroaded. Obviously Duke Lacrosse, they got railroaded.
Michael Jackson, not the singer Michael Jackson, right? But Michael Jackson.
No, I'm talking about Michael Jackson, the singer. I know. I'm someone who I used to believe Michael Jackson, the singer, was guilty, and then I through a bizarre series of circumstances, I've delved into that, and I believe that Michael Jackson, while super weird, was not a child molester, and there's no evidence that he was, and there would be massive evidence that if in fact, he was. There'd be a hell of a lot more than 4 accusers going after billions of dollars if Michael Jackson was actually a serial child abuser, especially in this day and age. But I mean, it doesn't stop there. Brett Kavanaugh was totally innocent.
Yeah.
This Jim Jordan, Ohio State wrestling story is total bullcrap, complete bullcrap. I've done a deep dive into that. Yeah. Basically, the entire issue of sex abuse / rape has become so toxic that the media never analyzes the actual core allegation. And so then they just accept the core allegation is true. And then oftentimes you get a domino effect. And then they get into these bizarre, that's what happened in Penn State. You get into this bizarre world where people are accused of a cover-up when nothing actually happened to cover up. And frankly, that's the easiest way. If you think about it, that's the easiest way to get caught in a cover-up, is if you're involved in a situation that didn't happen, because you're acting as if it didn't happen. And then in retrospect, if people decide, well, no, this actually did happen, children were being molested, what you did looks terrible in retrospect. But what you were dealing with was a completely different situation than what we thought we were dealing with 10, 15 years later. And I think the most astonishing and troubling element of this entire topic, and there are many, is that we have now reached the point, Chris, when it comes to these type of allegations, where it is actually more difficult to prove your own innocence, which you're not supposed to have to do anyway, but in order to, it's more difficult to defend yourself against old claims, ancient claims of sex abuse than it is of contemporary claims. There used to be, the media has completely changed their rules on how to deal with these situations. It used to be these allegations were not taken seriously, at least until there was a criminal charge against somebody, or at the very least, a civil trial verdict. If there was a verdict or a criminal charge, okay, now we can report on this because there's some legitimacy to it. Today, the media reports on any allegation. It doesn't even have to be a criminal charge. Doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be a lawsuit filed. It's automatically presumed to be true. And there also used to be an assumption that, wait a minute, old allegations, especially very old allegations, are inherently suspect, because you're inherently, for all sorts of very good reasons. That's why there was a statute of limitations. We've now gotten rid of the statute of limitations in New York. In New York, the governor decided basically there would be a free-for-all for a year, that you could come up with any sex abuse allegation you wanted, no matter how old it was, which is ridiculous. There's a reason why there's a statute of limitations. And part of that is old allegations are, inherently, in my mind, less credible, because why didn't you tell anybody for all these years? And 2, they're much more difficult to defend, because first of all, the only way you can defend yourself in this day and age is, I wasn't there. That's the number one way you can do it. Well, how do you prove you weren't there 20, 30 years ago? Definitively. And so weirdly, we've gotten into this position where the media treats old allegations of sex abuse with more credibility than they do contemporary allegations. I find it interesting in the Trevor Bauer situation. That was a contemporary allegation, which never had a criminal charge, and the lawsuit was settled out of court. And now there's all sorts of information indicating that Trevor Bauer was railroaded. Well, that's actually, at least on the right, in the right-wing media, that's gotten a lot of play, that Trevor Bauer was railroaded. I wonder if this was an allegation from 20 years ago, whether or not that would be the case, because Trevor Bauer wouldn't have the videotape that she took of herself in his bed. He wouldn't have the text messages that she sent to friends. And so that, in the Sandusky case, that was one of the most bizarre elements of this, where these allegations that were all bogus, they were all obviously bogus, were given more weight because they were old. And therefore, the media decided, well, you know, that's just the way these cases work. Bullshit. That's not the way these cases work. They always come with evidence. There's always pornography. There's always payoffs. There's always drugs, alcohol. There's always actual hard evidence. Sometimes there's physical evidence, DNA evidence. There was nothing in this case at all when there should have been mountains of evidence. And there was a media firestorm that created this rush to judgment. Anyway, I think that this is maybe the weakest point of vulnerability in the entire media industrial complex is when it comes to allegations of sex abuse or rape. It is like kryptonite to the news media. They are completely incapable of handling these cases properly. I would say race, rape, and Republicans, the 3 R's. If those are the 3 words, if any of those 3 words are involved in a news story, the news media is far more likely to blow it, because those are all points of great vulnerability for the news media.
You know, this is one reason why I do still think it's pretty probable that Desiree Washington's accusations against Mike Tyson were true. She went to the police immediately, and there wasn't, and of course we didn't have the evidence, but that's one case where I think maybe it was probable, but other than that, and you know, that was a huge trial too, but
I don't, you know, I don't know what to make of the Mike Tyson allegations. I really don't. I mean, I was on the air at the time during the trial, and so I was covering it, and that was a very different era when it came to how people viewed these types of allegations. I mean, you know, to me, it felt like one of those situations where what she thought was happening was different than what he thought was happening. In other words, did she believe that she was raped? I have no problem believing that. Did he believe that he didn't rape her? I also can see that as being possible. And because you got, I mean, the world Mike Tyson is living in, people, I mean, it's one of the many, 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 many problems in this area is the media is terrible when it comes to evaluating how famous, rich, attractive men are treated in romantic situations. They are not treated as normal human beings. They are used to women doing everything and anything they want without even having to ask. So it's almost like they're trained in this. I'm not saying this is good or bad, or certainly not, and oftentimes it's not healthy, but they are trained to believe that they are entitled to everything because that's what women are giving them. The media refuses to acknowledge that men like Mike Tyson or other men who have been famous, who have been accused of similar situations without evidence, that somehow women aren't throwing themselves at these men, that they're not literally throwing their panties at them. I mean, it's absurd. It's an absurdity. And the other part of this equation is this. I don't. This is getting too far afield, but I just have a hard time believing that men who are in this situation, famous, rich, attractive men, who are living in a world where women are giving them everything they want, who are throwing their love at them. Why would those people have enough anger? Because that's what you have to have. You have to have anger and hatred towards women to sexually assault somebody. Now, somebody who is in Mike Tyson's position, I'm not saying it didn't happen, by the way, because there's other reasons why Mike Tyson literally, his job was to beat the crap out of people. So I think he's in a different realm than maybe some other people. But some of these other accusers, like for instance, I'm very good friends with Matt Lauer. Matt Lauer didn't rape anybody. I'm 1,000% positive of that. And Matt Lauer had he loved women. Women women were very willing to do virtually anything Matt Lauer wanted at a certain stage of his life. And it was problematic for his marriage, but that's a completely different situation. So the idea that Matt doesn't have any anger towards women that would want him to sexually assault anybody, nor does anybody in Matt Lauer's position. You love women. Women have been fantastic to you. So the media just refuses to acknowledge reality when it comes to the dynamic, the unique dynamic between very prominent men and not all women, but a lot of women who behave in a way that is very different towards these men than they might normally do so. And by the way, sometimes that means, afterwards thinking, boy, I can't believe I just did that. I feel kind of bad about that. Maybe I really didn't mean to do that. Maybe I was forced into doing that. That is an evolution of thought that I think sometimes does happen, because celebrity does make women do, and does men as well, does make some women do some pretty crazy things that they might regret later on. And in this day and age, that might turn into an allegation of some sort of sex abuse or assault that wasn't based in reality.
Yeah, there's a lot of things. Yeah, it's like I said, these guys don't have to rape anybody. That's the thing that I always ask myself.
Of course not. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And so where would that anger towards women come from? And again, Mike Tyson might be a different example. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot of different things to evaluate there too. And I've just it's been so, and I don't know where this is going to end up. It's but I hope
I hate to be optimistic, but I sense that there's starting to be some pushback, and it's all being driven by the right-wing media. I mean, the right-wing media has embraced Trevor Bauer to a certain extent. They have embraced Russell Brand to a certain extent. That would not have happened certainly during the height of the Me Too movement. So there might be some pushback, at least on the right now. People going, wait a minute, what the hell is going on here? And I think the Brett Kavanaugh situation, which was so ridiculous, may have opened some eyes on that front.
Yeah, I hope we can get out of this in some positive manner. But otherwise, I don't know where sports is going to go from this, because the one thing that I think a lot, when we turn on sports, we don't want to think about politics. It's an escape, and that's what I think a lot of people just hate seeing politics ever come into their sports. It's just the same reason I don't want to see pizza when I go to Chick-fil-A. I don't want to see chicken when I go to Pizza Hut.
I agree. But unfortunately, Chris, these sports entities, these leagues know that they have us by the balls. And it was proven during COVID. It was proven, as I said, in the NFL during Colin Kaepernick. It's been proven, numerous times. What happened with Arizona and the Martin Luther King holiday, what happened with Major League Baseball and the All-Star game. It's been proven time and time again that conservative fans will not revolt because they love it too much and there's nowhere else to go. And because of that, these leagues now know we can crap in their face and they'll take it. And therefore we will continue to be crapped in our face until we don't take it anymore. And I don't know when that point comes.
I do know some, though. I know a guy who was a lifelong 49ers fan. And then when loved Joe Montana, loved Jerry Rice. And then when Colin Kaepernick happened, he just I'm not a 49er fan anymore. Well, that was nuts.
I will say, here's what I will say. I think that these leagues, see, the people that are in charge of these leagues, they don't care what's going to happen 20 years from now. They only care what's going to happen 5 years from now, right? Because that's generally the duration of their contract, okay? And so no one is thinking 20 years down the road. But in 20 years, and maybe it'll be sooner than that, I don't know. But in 20 years, I think sports is going to completely collapse in this country. And the reason why is because, one, I think it'll keep getting worse, but also because guys like you and me will either be dead or, not really watching much anymore, or not really being mattering anymore. Okay. So a generation that remembers, see, we still have a very strong memory as kids, as in our formative years, of what sports was and what it meant to society. And we grew up in an era with 4 TV channels and everyone got a newspaper every day. And so when an event happened in sports, it made a mark. It made a mark. Like if every team that won a Super Bowl, you remembered that. It made a mark. You remember the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team forever because that made a mark because we didn't move on in 5 minutes. Okay. And there weren't 100 games on television at any given moment. Hell, the U.S. Olympic hockey game against Russia wasn't even on live television. And so this is important, I think, because once our generation dies off, you're going to have a generation of people in our place that don't have those marks because we've been living in an era that for 20 or 30 years, we move on in 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, there's no mark being made.
Oh, yeah.
And so therefore, when they're in our age, they're not going to give a shit. They're going to be busy with kids and jobs and everything else. And I believe that passion, that passion will be gone. The connection to the sport and to the league will be so dramatically faded that you're going to see a collapse. You're going to see an utter collapse. The golden goose will be dead with once our generation is gone. That's what's holding it together right now. And so, I mean, I likely will not be alive to see it, but I think there will be a massive collapse when it comes to professional sports in the next maybe to 15 to 20 years. It'll be completely toasted.
I'll make a confession right here, and she's out of the hospital right now. But when I heard Mary Lou Retton was in the ICU, I was crying.
That's an interesting example. That's a really interesting example because you wouldn't feel that way about Simone Biles, right? And Simone Biles, by the way, is way better than Mary Lou Retton was.
Oh yeah, they all are now. Yeah, but I was a 13-year-old boy. She was a 16-year-old boy. I grew up 60 miles from her hometown.
That is a really great example because in 1984, Mary Lou Retton made a mark because in 1984, you could still make a mark. All right. Yeah. Making a mark in 2023 to the extent of a Mary Lou Retton is it's not impossible, but you basically have to be a Tom Brady to make that level of mark. I mean, and by the way, it's a weird example of this. Look at the reaction to the death of the Matthew Perry.
Matthew Perry.
Right? Is Matthew right? Matthew Perry. I can't believe I almost blanked on his name. Matt. Okay, so there's been a huge reaction to the death of Matthew Perry. Matthew Perry has not been a major TV movie figure. I mean, he's done some things post Friends, but it's been almost a couple of decades now since Friends was as big a deal as it was.
Yeah, 2000.
But Friends made a mark. Friends made a mark. And so each of the 6 characters in that show made a mark, right? What show today, 20 years from now, is going to have a person starring only in that show whose death is going to make an impact like Matthew Perry's? Nobody. It won't exist because no one's making a psychological mark in people's brains the way that the Friends did in their era. And so, and it's the same thing in sports. And so I think eventually that's going to have a major impact.
Yeah, I think it will. Well, John, it's been great having you come on here back again. I do think sports is probably in trouble, and and we've just got a lot less kids playing them too.
Well, that's I think what panicked the NFL. I think the NFL panicked when the concussion issue got as much traction as it did, and that concussion movie, which I don't even think was very, you know, from a fact-based perspective, I mean, the concussion issue is real, but I think it's been a bit overblown, and that movie did not help. And I think they panicked when they started to see that kids were not playing tackle football largely because their parents were not allowing them to play tackle football. And that's why they're embracing flag football. And that's why they're doing everything they can to make the game in my view, way too safe. And so I think that's a big part of this. And, you know, look, kids today are way busier and have a lot more stimuli than kids when you and I were young. And so that, you know, society is dramatically changing. And I have to say, baseball has hung in there better than I expected. I mean, they made some rules changes this year. I thought baseball was in real big trouble because of the attention span of the younger generation today was just not long enough for baseball to survive. And that's they've addressed that to a degree with the pitch clock. But but I still think baseball has always been about the connection between a dad and his son. And I think that similarly, the connections between dads and sons is fading with each generation.
Oh yeah.
For a lot of different reasons. And so I would put baseball right in there for different reasons in sports that are going to be in big trouble once this current generation dies off.
I've always said that baseball was the perfect sport for radio. It's slow enough that you can describe.
But we don't live in a radio.
Yeah, that's the whole thing, and that really was the heyday of baseball popularity. You can describe it well enough that that you know what's going on. It's slow enough. It was a great sport for radio, but yeah. But anyway, yeah, it's good. It's interesting to think about where we're going to go here. Maybe we'll have new sports, but it's sports tell you a lot about what a culture is. You know, it's always been interesting that soccer's never been that big in America, and I tell people, well, it's largely because Americans hate ties. But you know, But yeah, well, okay, John, it's been great having you here. Where can we find you out on the net?
Well, I'm active on Twitter with my handle is Zigman Freud, Zigman Freud, and I have a bi-weekly podcast called The Death of Journalism out each Tuesday and Thursday mornings. So check out The Death of Journalism.
Okay, well, thank you very much, John. It's been great having you on there. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, check out my novel, Escape from the Village, go to my Substack. I'm Chris Baker, and we're out.